Okay, let's get into it. Let's get into crow, Bakasana. There's a few things that make Bakasana a bit tricky and a few things to pay attention to. So Bakasana is the sort of two-handed arm balance with the feet off the floor, squeezing the heels towards the buttocks. There's a few things that make the asana tricky. One is that it can be scary. So that sense of fear can make the pose difficult for us. There can also be flexibility limitations, strength limitations, or just coordination limitations. Like what we don't often talk about in asana practice is that there's a process that your brain goes through, that your central nervous system goes through in learning how to recruit which muscles in which order and to what extent, right? Do I need 20% hamstring and 5% deltoid and this, and that's not a process that, it's not necessarily the case that being more conscious of it, like knowing all those percentages cognitively will help you in that process, but more experience with the asanas will help you because it's usually an unconscious process to begin with. Like, any physical activity, any sport or dance or any sort of physical activity that we undertake, a lot of the learning process is taken up with the central nervous system just figuring out what's what and how to make the moves more efficient over time, which is one of the reasons why we sweat less over time. And it feels like, I think there's sometimes an internal pressure of like, oh, I need to make every pose harder so that I can sort of get as much out of my practice as I can, right? But that in and of itself is a bit of a misunderstanding. I think it's actually good over time to let your body's natural efficiencies take over. And it's true, you won't be exerting as much after a while. That's a good thing, right? You won't be burning as many calories or dripping as many drops of sweat over time because your central nervous system, your muscle memory, your actual muscles should be getting more efficient the better you know the asanas. So that comes with experience and learning about them. And I really encourage you try everything you can about every asana. We're going to use props today, and sometimes I hear from practitioners who have a little bit more experience, who have more classroom hours. Sometimes they feel like they don't need the props anymore, but I would say there's something to learn from every experience of it, and overall that's just going to add to our overall understanding of the asana and our overall understanding of ourselves. Whether, and it's not for us to necessarily like prejudge, right? So we're going to try crow a few different ways with a handful of different props in order to sort of bring about some different experiences and hopefully bring together more understanding or deeper understanding of crow or Bakasana. The first thing you want to work on is the connection between your hands and the earth, and I'll have a separate asana lab about hands and about learning how to connect through the hands. But in short, you want to make sure that you are connecting down through the knuckles of the hands. In particular, people tend to lift up this knuckle that joins the index finger to the rest of the hand. So you want to do as much as possible to work towards getting that part of the hand down to the floor. And again, we can explore that in different ways in a different lesson. But for now, let's move on. Let's move up, onward and upward. So a big difference, the distance between the hands can also make a really big difference in our results. So oftentimes I will see people putting their hands much too narrow. If you're looking at me from the front and my wrists are narrower than my shoulders, it's not that you can't do crow. You certainly can, but it's much more difficult. So start with the wrists shoulder width distance apart. So the arms want to be parallel to one another, or even a touch wider if you need a little bit more stability or if you're just starting out. So you can actually go just a touch wider than the shoulders in order to kind of give you a little bit more, a little bit wider of a base, a little bit more stability, right? And then one other thing that can happen is if sometimes the elbows kind of spread out to the sides, maybe because there's like a tightness in maybe the biceps or the lats, or maybe there's more of a focus sort of on the muscles of the front body. So it's very important to learn how to really turn the elbows inwards. And we worked on that a bit in my upper arm rotation video, which you can review, but you want to have a lot of strength in that external rotating factor. Now, if that's difficult, then for now, another modification you could make is rotating the hands a little out to the sides. And what that does is that encourages an upper arm rotation that then helps me to keep my elbows moving more backwards rather than winging to the side. If even that doesn't resolve it, then we can try placing a belt over the arms, just like right at the elbows, and experience crow with a belt around the arms, and that will prevent also the elbows from kind of winging out to the sides. So if that's one of the limitations that you're finding, then that's two things that may help you to get a little bit closer to your Bakasana. Now, there's a couple of different ways to come into Bakasana. Let's talk about knee placement. So in some classes, you probably hear the teacher teach it as like, place your knees on your upper arms, meaning kind of balancing the kneecaps on sort of the back of the flesh of the upper arm. That's one way, and it's certainly possible, and probably for some of us it even feels more achievable in that way. There's a second way, which is to take the knees around the upper arms, and then the energy of the knees is almost squeezing inwards. So I'm using the muscles of the legs to almost squeeze the upper arm bones together. And that actually can also be a little bit of a help if my elbows are winging outwards. So I'm gonna lean some weight into the hands. I'm gonna squeeze my knees in towards each other, and that can help me with the balance. Now, I encourage you to try both and experience both and be familiar with both ways. And just because you find one of the ways more difficult and one of the ways easier doesn't mean one is right or wrong. They're just two different expressions of the asana and two different ways to explore the asana. So, you know, I would say resist the temptation to assign correctness based on ease right? If it's harder, if it's easier, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong inherently. And I would also watch the tendency of the mind to kind of say things like, well, I don't do it that way, right? So sometimes, like, if I'm taking someone else's class and they're teaching crow a certain way, and it doesn't happen to be the way that I prefer, I'm gonna drop that for now. I'm gonna drop that, and I'm gonna try to experience what the teacher is encouraging me to experience, because they're sharing something about the practice that maybe I am missing. And so I'm going to drop my preference and at least entertain the teacher's point of view for that moment, you know? So two knee placements for now. And then, you know, for the time being, at least in the learning process, it's also easier to have the elbows more bent. The more bent the elbows are, the easier for most people to balance. And then more so over time, you can start to experiment with having straighter arms, but that's a little bit later. Let's get back into some of the limitations that might arise in Bakasana. So let's revisit the fear component. So for the most part, we're like balancing on our hands, which we're not used to. We're also like staring at the floor and moving towards it, and the floor is getting sort of ever closer to my face, and that is terrifying. So one recommendation I have is to place, I like a couple of blocks, because the blocks feel, well, I use these like steady cork blocks. I don't feel that styrofoam is all that, it doesn't feel that sturdy to me. It feels a little more wiggly. So you could put blocks, you could put a stack of blankets, you could put like a small footstool, like a step stool if you have something like that, or like one of those little Zen meditation seats. Notice how I've got my blocks a little out in front of my hands. And with my feet on the floor, I'm not even going to pick up my feet yet. I'm going to place my forehead all the way down on the blocks. And I'm going to let the weight of the head go into the blocks. And then I can pick up one foot at a time, or I could even work on picking up both feet. And I don't have to worry about sort of seeing the floor coming towards me, because my head is already secure on those blocks. So experiment like this. You might have to change the height of the blocks a little bit depending on how tall you are. But just notice, like, you know, if I'm too tall, I'm going to have a harder time picking up my feet because I haven't moved forward enough. So it has to be low enough that the weight of your head is actually pressing into the blocks, and my weight is forward enough that the feet can actually come off the floor. So it might be a little bit lower than your instinct wants it to be, but you can experiment that way as well. So let's talk about the mechanism of actually getting the feet off the floor. So, of course, there's the core strength. There's the flexibility involved in being able to bring my knees to my arms. So that's item one. One thing to work on is the flexibility of getting knee to arm. So you can do this in a number of different ways. All of your sort of hip opening standing poses will be good for that. Extended side angle, lizard, all that good stuff. So there's the mobility piece. Then there's also a strength piece of the front abdominal, the front of the core, of being able to really curl inwards and be strong and contract. So it can also be helpful to work on this strength component here. One thing that I don't hear talked about often with regards to crow is the strength that it takes to pull the foot towards the buttocks, which is hamstring strength. Some other things as well. A tiny, tiny bit of glutes, but mostly hamstring strength. So let's do this together. You're gonna love it. No, it is very revealing how even though our hamstrings need to be very strong for walking and biking and running and all of the things that we need our hamstrings for, it's interesting how suddenly they're going to feel less strong than I assumed they were, right? Like, I always think of myself as pretty strong, but even me, when I do this one, I feel like, oh God, the hamstrings are not so strong. Okay, so you're going to take a block and just put it kind of like against the bottom of the butt cheek. So not sort of straight to the back, but a little bit under. Then bend your knee and kind of hold your block in place with your heel. And then squeeze that block between your heel and your buttocks. So it's almost like I'm trying to bring my heel towards my buttocks, but the block stops it. And do that like 3 times, 5 seconds each on this side. And if you got a little cramp in your hamstring, I am neither surprised. I'm not surprised, and it's showing us, right, where that little thing could be worked on. So again, squeeze. Try to hold for 5 seconds each time. Do a total of 3, 5 seconds each. Ooh. Ooh. The right one is even worse. Okay, good to know. So that strength is also necessary for that movement of actually bringing the heels up and squeezing towards the buttocks. So that could be another thing to sort of work on in your journey towards Bakasana. And then, another aspect of leaning into the hands might not necessarily be the fear. Well, let's put it this way. There is the literal fear of, like, the face kind of like moving closer to the floor and like your hands aren't going to catch you. But another part of that is like, what if the back body was supported enough that you wouldn't feel like it will prevent you from going too far, in other words. So let's take our blocks. And this time, instead of putting the blocks under the front side of the asana, we're going to put the blocks under the feet. And so one thing that this does is, actually, in order to reach down to the floor, look how I really have to tuck my knees way high up into my upper arms. So it's encouraging a certain amount of that flexibility of me getting my knees close to my arms. The second thing is that because my weight is already up, it's already off the floor, it doesn't then take as much forward movement for me to start to get the toes to feel lighter on the blocks. It's less road to travel because I'm already 90% of the way there. Instead of having to start all the way from back here and having to travel all this way forward, and I don't know when I'm gonna stop, oh my gosh, right? It's much scarier. So, putting all of these modifications together and experiencing different ones at different times, or, working with the same set of modifications for a couple of weeks, you could start to develop a really nuanced sort of understanding of the asanas. And there's no shortcut. There's no way to develop a relationship with the asanas other than to experience them more often, right? Like two stories. Sometimes when I teach an unusual asana in class, one that maybe I know that group doesn't practice very, very often, I like to remind myself and the students that are there with me that, if we only do crow pose once every 6 weeks or so, then, the learning process is a bit slower than if we practiced it every single day. And when I have made a true commitment to myself to develop a relationship with a particular asana, if there's something I'm not getting and I'm like, oh, I just really don't understand this pose, I can't do it, I don't understand what goes into it. When I tell you, I have occasionally made the commitment, like, okay, I'm gonna spend every single day for as long as it takes focusing on this one asana in my practice. And so I'll construct my personal practice around that asana. How much hamstring strengthening can I do? How much arm strengthening can I do? How much wrist strengthening can I do? And discovering the elements that are going into that particular shape, it usually takes me a few weeks, right? But of really focused commitment and daily interaction with that asana. And not just doing it the same way that I've always done it, but trying different arrangements. Trying, lay down on my back. Or what would crow pose feel like if I'm on my back? What does crow pose feel like if I'm on a block? Or with a belt? Or with a fox in a box? Little Dr. Seuss reference for those who may not be familiar with Dr. Seuss. But anyhow, the only real way to develop that intimacy is to create more interaction with it. Okay, so practice diligently, practice seriously, practice smart, practice regularly, and you will have it.